Doctors and nurses of Reddit, what is the funniest thing you've heard when a patient was on anesthesia but you couldn't laugh? I have epilepsy and we have a fugue state after our seizures where we're confused and loopy, but it's also blacked out in our heads, so I don't remember this at all. Apparently. In the ambulance after the seizure I was singing Britney Spears' Oops I Did It Again in reference to seizing again. The EMTs found it so funny that they made sure to tell me about it once I was in the hospital and awake enough to remember. Then a few weeks later I got a package with a Britney Spears CD in it and a post-it note saying seize the moment. But seriously. Take your medicine. When sending my patient to sleep, we were giving the Drugas via the IV. He said you'll have to give me lots of that stuff, referring to the Drugas. Worried I said why? Thinking he an undisclosed allergy or condition we hadn't known about. Instead he said as he fell asleep because I smoke weed. Difficult to keep a straight face. When I had surgery on my ankle, I apparently got my DR to laugh. And some of the nurses after the surgery to laugh. So they gave me a shot of something to numb me up or do something important before they actually put me to sleep. I remember at the point where they gave me a second shot. After the second shot, my DR told me to count backwards from 10. Apparently I just looked at him and said no need, and passed the duck out. After the surgery when I was waking up, but still pretty out of it, the nurses brought my dad back to help get me ready to go. When I saw him, I yelled, "You're not my mom." To which he replied, "I'm your dad." Dumbus. Apparently that was the best thing the nurses had heard all day. I was getting a hysterectomy. And apparently right after the Drugas started kicking in, I loudly proclaimed to the nurse that I named my cervix. She asked the name. And I slurred cervix a lot and passed out. I wonder if she laughed. Or if she just rolled her eyes. I'm glad I didn't die on the operating table. Because those would be my last words. Yikes. Not a DR. But a patient. Coming out of post-surgical haze. And there was this woman moaning and carrying on really loudly. Quiet for a moment or two. Then I asked the nurse to shut her up because she was really bothering me, only to be told it was me making that god-awful racket. Not a doctor nor a nurse. But when my father went under for the removal of several teeth, he woke up, he revealed an almost encyclopedic knowledge of bridges, which he revealed to the cab driver. I have never heard of him talking about them before or after, but he was confident enough to name his top 10 bridges and their engineers. I once went in for a day surgery operation on my knee and I knew my then girlfriend's mum worked on the day ward. The catch was she didn't know we were dating. Cut to me waking up in recovery after the op and there was a nurse standing next to my bed who asked what was it she wasn't allowed to find out. Turns out I'd been saying Julie who works here can't find out what we're doing. Thankfully there was more than one Julie on the ward, so I just mumbled I had no idea and must have been talking nonsense. Nurse in the ER. We do conscious sedations for broken bones or chest tubes and stuff. We make sure to remove all family from the room prior to sedating because patients really do say some pretty bad stuff. One was a kid who came out to all the staff and he had never told anyone before. The other was a woman who talked about the sexual troubles with her husband and how they were having marital troubles. After getting my wisdom teeth taken out, the nurse waiting for me to wake up told my mom that when I opened my eyes I sat up immediately and asked for my teeth. I asked the doc prior if I could keep them and he said he'd leave them in a baggie, so she was going to give it to me anyway. Mayo was brought out to a waiting area so she could have my mom come get me. I guess someone else was there and I very proudly showed this stranger my bagged teeth. Then passed out again. She told my mom it wasn't uncommon for people to ask if they can keep their teeth, but she'd never seen someone be that desperate to have them. She also made it a point to say I kept putting the baggie up to my face and getting a very serene smile, lol. Not a doctor or a nurse, but was a patient. I had a few surgeries in my teens. I went to a children's hospital, up to 18 years old, for the surgeries. I always remembering waking up in a recovery room full of crying kids. Apparently one time I woke up sedated to high heaven and told a nurse to tell those kids to shut the duck up. I'm trying to sleep. Apparently everyone thought it was hysterical. My nickname from then on was Sleeping Beauty. Not me but my so. When he was F2, he was helping demonstrate insertion of an endoscope for a colonoscopy on an elderly lady for some undergrad med students. She was anesthetized and, as the camera went in, she said, "Oh, Harold, not tonight. You know I don't like it in there." All the med students were a little stunned at first, but he just burst out laughing and they joined in. I was taking care of a nurse from another specialty. She had to go under general anesthesia and went off for 30 minutes about how we have all of the good Drew guts in land. Fentanyl is the best sheet ever. etc. I definitely told her all about it when she fully came out of it. Professional courtesy and stuff. I woke up at the end of getting my wisdom teeth pulled out. And I was high as a kite. He had one more tooth to pull out and said it might hurt. And I just yelled, "I ain't no itch." The nurse couldn't keep it together. Last surgery I had. Right as they pushed the needle of the good stuff, I asked the entire theater if anyone needed anything while I was out. They laughed. I passed out into oblivion. Surgeon here. I had a patient try to munch through the surgical drape that separates anesthesia from surgical site to create a peephole, while mumbling on how he was curious what was happening on the other side. He was also hitting on an older scrub nurse with no bullshit attitude. It was hysterical. Propofol is hell of a drug. My wisdom teeth extraction. I woke up crying and the doctor nurses were really concerned until I told them I was crying because I missed my wisdom teeth. They enjoyed that one. I then proceeded to point at the light switch and ask them to turn the radio on. And ask the nurse if the doctor was a good guy because I wanted to invite him to my birthday party. I was probably 16. I'll preface this by saying that I don't like hospitals. Especially when I'm the patient. I went in for a colonoscopy and was given propofol and whatever for pain. I'm a complete drug wimp, so fell asleep in about 2 seconds. When it was over, I was being taken to recovery and I kind of woke up. I said, "Am I done? Can I go home?" And the nurse said, "You can't go home until you pass gas so that we know all of the air is out of your intestines." I thought, right then. And as I was being wheeled into the little recovery bay, with curtains, not walls, I pushed as hard as I could. Simultaneously my husband stood up and said, "Hey. Bah," and I farted so loudly and for so long that I almost launched myself into the next room. I heard my husband bellow, "Jesus Christ." And then I heard some laughter from somewhere else. I said, "I'm ready to go home," and passed back out while my husband stood there looking around in confusion about what had just happened. I've never heard the end of this. First, not a doctor yet. Second, everyone in the room laughed, including the patient after we told him later. But I like this story. I was working in the ER when a man came in with a dislocated shoulder. He said he was riding a mule and it threw him off into a tree. Later he was given twilight sedation and the doctor pops his shoulder back in. While he's coming to, he says, "Does anyone here want to buy a mule? I've got one and I don't really want it anymore." It was especially funny because he was totally serious. Hi. But serious. Not a doctor or nurse. But my own experience. While sedated for wisdom teeth, I apparently kicked a nurse in the gut who had grabbed my ankle to keep me from twitching. When I woke up I asked this same nurse to take a selfie with me before I knew I kicked her. She didn't tell me until after the selfie. I have a picture to commemorate the time I assaulted a nurse. The last 2 sedations I've had, surgery and colonoscopy, I've woken up to be the nicest person in the world apparently. I would wave at anyone who would walk by the bed and tell them that I hope that they would have a nice day and would compliment everyone. I kept forgetting to breathe though. So they needed someone by my bed to remind me to breathe. I just remember waking up to someone nonchalantly going, "Boop. Take another breath again." My husband had to have an upper GI endoscopy done a few months ago. He woke straight up by all appearances. Had a serious detailed conversation with the physician about the results and walked out under his own steam. Even offered to drive us. He decided he really wanted Chinese food. Not delivery or takeout. It had to be buffet. Apparently the Drugas hadn't actually worn off. Because he came to in the buffet. As far as he's concerned. He passed out in the DRS office and woke up in front of a heaping pile of beef teriyaki. When my wife was getting a colonoscopy, there was this huge dude also in recovery. This dude made Michael Clark Duncan look like a 98-pound weakling. Anyways, he's half loopy from the anesthesia and says in a very kid-like voice, "My tummy has a viewy bad ouchie." He kept repeating it for like 10 minutes and I'm thinking that if I laugh he'll remember after recovering and turn me into something resembling chunky salsa without breaking a sweat. When I had a minor surgery on my hand, I remember being pretty hungry before going under. While I was out, I dreamt of burritos and tacos. The surgeon informed me that I was describing my perfect Taco Bell order in slurs and mumbles almost the whole time. Not a doctor but my own experience. Woke up and started screaming my lungs hurt. In English. Heard everyone laughing. No one could understand me because I live in Brazil. Then proceeded to tell them, in Portuguese, that I couldn't see anything. Naturally the nurses were scared that I had gone blind. Only for me to follow with, "I need my glasses." When I had to get a cyst removed from my wrist and was in the recovery room, apparently I was holding hands with my wife and said, "Your hands are so cold. Must be all that ice I bought you," and I pointed to her wedding ring. I don't remember it at all. But she told me the nurse thought it was hilarious. Not a doctor or nurse. But I've gone under a couple of times. The one I remember is when I had my colonoscopy. I told the doctor. I made sure it was nice back there. I got my ass crack waxed for you. To be fair, I had gotten a Brazilian 2 days earlier. But that wasn't the reason. I'm also pretty sure that he saw his share of hairy ass cracks. After I got my wisdom teeth taken out, I decided to play some music. I must have pressed play and lost focus and then remembered what I was doing after the first song had ended. The second song began playing, but I began singing the first song because in my mind, I just pressed play. That must have been the worst round some poor nurse had ever heard. My husband had his wisdom teeth out and while under sedation he told the DR and the nursing staff that he couldn't wait to get me home and into bed. Rather explicitly. It was hilarious. Also the dentist had the same name as a famous male porn star. I was waiting for him to make a joke about that, but he was shuffled out pretty quick once he started talking about our sex life. I'm not in medicine. When my sister had her wisdom teeth removed, she had general anesthesia. She woke up and asked the doctor for her teeth so she could give them to the tooth fairy. When I had mine done, I reportedly didn't do anything stupid. However, my mom left me in a locked car in the pharmacy parking lot while I was still not quite conscious. That was a terrifying way to wake up. Not a doctor or a nurse. Don't even play one on TV. I had to have an emergency C-section. As the anesthesiologists were trying to decide if I needed a general or local. I told them general. I did not want to be there. Somebody cutting my body open and pulling out another human? No. Hard pass. When I woke up in recovery, the first thing I asked was how big? Meaning, of course. How big was the baby? The nurse said that they weren't sure yet. The scales in NICU didn't go that high. But they thought around 10-11 pounds. 11 pounds 10 ounces was the final tally. My response. Husband vasectomy rusty knife. I remember hearing laughter as I drifted off again. But in that moment, I was dead serious. Went to see a PT who was mellowed on anxiolytics. He introduced himself as the Lord's busy and sent me to do his work. He then said, "I'm watching you," before proceeding to poke himself in the eyes trying to do the hand gesture. He then started crying vividly, stating, "I have seen the face of God. And he is crying." A massive look of shock and surprise overwhelmed him, followed by "I'm crying. I must be God," before he started yelling help. Clapping vividly. The community nurse, her student and the OT with me started laughing hysterically. Before he started singing happy birthday to the student. Not a doc. But I was put under for a routine operation a few months back. I woke up and remembered talking to my GF while taking pictures of the instruments inside the medical room. I work with equipment like it sometimes, so I wanted to take some picture for reference. I remember taking the pictures. I have the pictures on the phone. But I was there alone. GF was at work. When I went back for a checkup, the doc could barely hold his laughter in and had a smirk so big. I still don't know what I did or said and who was in the room with me. Not a doctor. But when I was getting a completely dislocated shoulder reset, I turned to the ER staff and delivered this gem. Interstellar is the best film. And it remains the best film of the past decade. Duck the Revenant. Interstellar's where it's at. Med student here, and I have a really good one. It was at the end of a procedure, and as the patient is waking up, still dazed obviously, he just instinctively starts trying to jerk off his flaccid big dick. At first the women in the OR all thought he was just trying to go to the bathroom, but the guys all knew exactly what was going on. Everyone just kinda tried to look away and stifle their laughter. I just remember the medical fellow was teaching me something, as I am directly in the line of sight of this. Doctors, nurses, and hospital staff of Reddit, what are your experiences? Funny, sad, horrible, with people waking from anesthesia? NSFW. Told to me by my wife, confirmed by the nurse. I was in bed, hospital room, waiting for surgery. They already gave me meds to calm me, but they knocked me out. 2 nurses come in to move me to a gurney, but they were small and I'm big, they can't move me over. My wife came over and poked me in the ribs saying, "You're snoring, roll over." And I rolled right onto the gurney. Had a patient in for an endoscopy. As a matter of course, we place a speculum, think ball gag, but a metal ring instead of a ball, in the mouth through which to pass the scope so the patient doesn't bite the scope once they're under. We typically place it right at induction of anesthesia. This patient had the presence of mind to ask us what the safe word was before he lost consciousness as we placed the speculum. One of the rare times the whole OR erupted in laughter. I once had a patient start totally trashing her sister, telling me how she has always been the black sheep of the family, is a scumbag and wants to bang her husband. She's just going off. And sitting in the doorway was the sister, the only one there to support her after surgery. You could tell it was crushing for her. This was probably an hour after the patient left PACU. Conscious but still pretty whacked out. So I'm an ER tech. And we have this regular that comes in all the time. She's an old black lady who has a lot of health issues, including dementia. This time, I'm actually not entirely sure why she was coming in. But whatever it was, she needed to be intubated. So we sedated her, put the tube in and did what we needed. When everything was finished, we called EMS to pick her up and take her back home. When they arrived, the nurse and I went in to prep her to leave. The lady is just starting to wake up from sedation. So, with the EMT standing in the room, we take out her Foley catheter. Then, she queefs. The nurse and I smirk at each other. But this is fairly common and not the funny part. The funny part is that the noise seemed to surprise her, and apparently remind her what was going on. Because she gasps and then looks over to the EMTs and says in an attempt at a sexy voice, "You boys ever seen a black coochie before?" Everyone in the room had to take a second to attempt to regain composure. But the EMTs ended up having to leave the room and the nurse is crouching on the ground trying not to die. Capital I. Since I still have the Foley in my hands, don't have this freedom, and am forced to try to keep my sides from launching into orbit. It's since become a running joke around the ER. I had a patient pet an invisible kitty that was named after me. The next day, was completely with it and was wondering what happened to that kitty. A patient woke up from his wisdom tooth removal begging the doctor to let him be David Bowie. The doctor actually asked how that was supposed to happen. And the answer was that it would be fantastic. When my husband woke up from having his wisdom teeth surgically removed, his nurse was a rather large lady. Like 350 plus, he looked her dead in the eyes and said, "You're too beautiful to be a nurse. You should have been a model. Why don't you just come home with me and my wife?" Yes, he was propositioning a three-way with a 50-year-old 350-pound nurse. Most awkward moment of my life. Not a hospital stuff, but my great-grandfather had surgery one time and I was in the room when he woke up. He was a WWII veteran and was convinced that he was in an CPOW camp. He recognized me and told me I had to help him escape by killing the guards, nurses, because he knew I knew how to heal people. I was 16. Obviously a trained Krella. When the nurse came in, he was calm and kept motioning with his head at her to me and finally looked at me and said, "Heal her, now." She always came back with another male nurse after that. Not a doc or nurse. When I got my wisdom teeth out, they strapped my arm down for the IV anesthetic. Apparently. Before passing out, I looked up at the white-haired German dentist and said in my best Connery, "Goldfinger, do you expect me to talk?" The dentist didn't reply. But he did tell me after surgery that it was one of the funniest things anyone asked him in a haze. My father-in-law was in a car accident that shattered his face, several vertebrae, and his pelvis. This isn't so much a story about what he said, but what he did. He was in a coma for 3 weeks and had to be heavily restrained when coming out of it. He was a Marine in Vietnam. He was captured and escaped, and he still hated being restrained. My wife went to visit him on a Sunday, and the doctors told her that tomorrow he was going to be the first patient to use a new $30,000 restraint system that would cause him less discomfort. On Monday afternoon she visited again, and he was in the same restraints as before. My wife asked, and the nurse explained that he destroyed a restraint system. It lasted less than an hour. It wasn't salvageable. Not the doctor or the nurse. I had a lot of ear infections when I was younger. And my final time, I was about 7. I woke up to the Rugrats on a TV in the room. I hated the Rugrats at the time. Cue the following conversation. Me. Why are the Rugrats on? Doctor, you woke up earlier and said you wanted us to put on the Rugrats. We asked why. And you said that you hated the Rugrats and wanted to watch it so you could be angry. Me. Why did I want to be angry? Doctor, you said you wanted to be angry because you don't like being so happy all the time. Edit. Obligatory wow. One of my most upvoted comments is about my early life angst. Only behind my 5-word comment that referenced a trebuchet. Reddit works in mysterious ways. Tie. Went straight from the ER to surgery to put a plate in my badly broken arm. So I hadn't been on a ward etc prior to the operation. Came out of surgery and recovery and was being pushed in a hospital bed to a ward. We turned into a ward and it was full of elderly people. I was in my early 20s. I turned to the hospital porter pushing me and shouted, "Sorry, we seem to have taken a wrong turn. We're in the morgue." I was the patient. I'd had all 4 wisdom teeth out at once. And I woke up earlier than expected in recovery, early enough that they hadn't taken out the wadding at the back of my mouth meant to absorb the blood. So I woke up. Immediately felt like I was choking. And panicked. I leapt off the bed. And a bunch of nurses came to restrain me. Still out of it. I fought them and definitely gave one of them a good punch before they got me back on the bed. I passed out again straight away. Still feel bad about it. Poor nurse. 2 stories. 1. I had a lady in her 70s who drank martinis and took Xanax all day. Every day. So she had such a strong tolerance to the sedation I was giving her that she just totally stopped breathing while still awake. I had to say, "Ma'am, I'm going to have to bag you now." And she mouthed okay and I put the ambu bag on her face and force breathed for her until she got a respiratory effort back. 2. I was in helping with a heart procedure and the patient went into complete heart block and his heart stopped beating. I hop up to the table and start chest compressions while they are hurriedly trying to put in a temporary pacing wire. I had an arterial pressure waveform on the monitor, so I could see exactly how hard to do the compressions and the man never lost consciousness. So I'm doing chest compressions on a dude while he looks right at my face the whole time. So it was like press sorry for about 2 minutes until the pacing wire was in place. I shadowed a surgery once with this guy who woke up saying, "Give it to me straight, doc. Will I ever play the piano again?" All of us were cracking up and he then goes, "Oh. Wait. I don't know how to play the piano." Not a doctor. A friend was in a car crash. Pretty bad, he was in a coma for 2 months. He had a female doctor. For 2 months until he came out of his coma, every time his doctor was checking on he would reach up and grab her breast. Guessing he heard her voice. When we told him about it, he did not believe us. So he asked her and she confirmed it. Said she never stopped him because it seemed to keep him calm. I'm not a doctor nurse. But I heard about this after my wisdom teeth surgery. I apparently was still on anesthesia. And when they wheeled me out I had both arms stuck out and was making plane noises. They asked me what I was doing and I told them I was becoming my final form of a plane. Still do not know why I was doing it. My first memory when waking up from shoulder surgery was a somewhat panicked nurse rummaging through the blankets at the bottom of my bed repeatedly muttering, "Where are his legs? Where are his legs?" I always cross my legs when I sit lay down and apparently I must have done this as I was initially coming off the anesthesia. It freaked me out for a second. But then I processed what was going on. The nurse seemed relieved when I mumbled "there right here" and nearly kicked her in the face when I extended my legs. 3 times. The first time when I was 5. Tonsil surgery. My family is from Norway. And my grandmother always kept a pewter model of a longboat on her mantle. Just to explain why a 5-year-old would wake up screaming, "Get me back to the longboat." And then apparently, to quote my mother, go all Linda Blair on the doctors when they came in to try to give me antibiotics. That was nearly 25 years ago and my family still likes to joke about me managing to shriek my head off and throw punches after having just come out of throat surgery. By age 13. I'd tamed down some. And apparently only muttered and grilly at everyone while waking up. Age 26. All the fight had gone out of me. And I just cried whenever a nurse asked me a question. "How is your pain?" "Not bad." "I'm so sorry." "Don't be sorry." "Can you sit up for me?" Uncontrollable sobbing. "Okay then. Let's get you some apple juice." Fully disconsolate. Edit because I can't count. I was working in the pediatric ER and sedating a skater kid 14 or 15. We are talking more a wannabe suburban kid rather than a punk. Kinda kid that obviously joined a frat in college. His mom is there in the room as he starts waking up once we had his wrist set and in the cast. His mom is typical well-to-do suburban mom who spends lots of time at yoga and PTA meetings, that is. Not trashy at all, and family was likely from a well-to-do part of town. My buddy, who was fairly hairy on his arms etc., reached across his upper chest to grab an IV line. Kid was half asleep. Raised his head up with his eyes still closed and licked my buddy's arm with this exaggerated lick like it was an ice cream cone. Kid flops his head back onto the pillow and his mom just looks mortified in the 2-3 seconds that pass before he slurs out, "Man, I sure do love to lick some pussy." His mom immediately turned bright red and walked out of the room and we all busted out laughing except the guy who got licked. The ER doc was this young petite girl and she said she peed herself a little, she was laughing so hard. For months we would give that guy lick motions in the air when we passed him in the hall and putting Rolling Stone stickers on his locker etc. I still give him crap about that from time to time. My favorite is to catch him chatting or something standing at the desk and to lean over and sniff his forearm and ask if he has been fishing. Not a doctor or nurse. When my sister was 16, she had back surgery to repair a ruptured disc in her lower back. Apparently, The meds that they gave her before she was put under gave her low enough inhibitions that instead of counting backward from 10, she started belting out the lyrics to Roxanne. The OR staff later told my mom that not only were they amazed that someone that young knew the lyrics, that the way that she started singing was one of the funniest things they had seen in an OR. I'm not the medical professional in this story. My husband had emergency surgery a few years ago, and when he woke up, he was just different. I can't explain it. He recognized who I was, but his personality was completely different and the way he spoke to me was completely different. It's sort of like in movies where people wake up in someone else's body. It freaked me the duck out. 36 hours later, it was like he just woke up and was himself again. The weird part is, he had no memory of the past 36 hours. He remembers being sick and he remembers the emergency room. But after that, nothing. A lot of people came to visit him in that time period too. A bunch of family and everyone from the office, and he has no memory of any of them. The only thing I can think is that whatever medication that was used in the anesthesia that gawked him finally worked its way out of his system. I woke up from knee surgery and demanded a vodka and coke with no ice. Also, for some reason when I woke up I was freezing cold and shivering. One of the nurses hooked me up to some heater which blew warm air under the covers from the bottom of the bed. I then likened myself to Marilyn Monroe. I'm a 6'2" athletic guy. God told a story. When I was 8, I got a knee surgery. While on anesthesia, the travel between my hospital room and the alright tough, I was in a Formula 1 car. So I would make all the noise, telling people to faster. Make the sound of the tires too. The guys told my mom it was the funniest transfer they ever had. Everybody was laughing, including people in the hallway. The only thing I could think of as the patient was that I surprised a lot of nurses with how quickly I shook off the anesthetic. I would be walking around an hour later and getting changed ready to go home. They just looked dumbfounded. I was coming around from surgery and the nurse who was looking after me had a crush on a guy I dated when I first started nursing, several years before. It was rather surreal to go from deep sleep to talking about an ex-boyfriend I had hardly thought about in years. I almost feel it was an abuse of her power. I could have said anything coming out. You don't expect to be interrogated about a past relationship the first thing waking up from major surgery. In the end I found out some gossip. The relationship didn't last long and apparently he was hurt that I wasn't devastated when we broke up and that I started dating someone new within a few weeks. Slightly different in that it wasn't anesthesia, but rather sedative meds. I worked in a hospital years ago, and once had a patient who had an extreme paradoxical reaction, opposite of what is expected, to her Ambien. She went off the rails. She started hallucinating that she was in a hostage situation with a man who was killing babies. One nurse went in the middle of the night while doing her rounds and the patient attacked her with a folded wire hanger and severely beat her in the face and head. The nurse ended up with multiple broken bones in her face, blacked both eyes, and a number of deep wounds on her face. She was gone for a while on workman's comp but eventually quit, stating the experience had traumatized her and she didn't want to be in the building again. Don't know whatever happened to the patient, but I doubt she would have been punished or charged, since she was not in her right state of mind and nobody expected such a reaction to the medicine. Was the patient in this one? When I was 12 I had heart surgery and was getting wheeled down to the operating room. I was completely transfixed on my knee when I then asked the nurse if I could pet the kitty. She said sure, so I started petting and scratching my knee going AWW. Good kitty kitty. When I woke up from that surgery I spent about 5 days in an aesthetic hell, like a medically induced coma but not quite as severe, and cussed out every nurse that asked me how I was doing. I was intubated so I had to scratch out my hatred onto scrap paper and hope they could translate it. When I was off of the cocktail they were giving me I was back to my cheerful self and felt mortified about calling the pretty nurses working the ICU ward at Children's Hospital a bunch of stupid hunts. Apparently it happens all the time but I still cringe when I think about it. My brother had knee surgery done. and at the time was running his own business and was stressed out. When he was coming off the anesthesia, he was trying to get out of bed and demanding to let him go because he had to get back to work. It took 3 nurses to hold him down to convince him to stay in bed. The sad and funny thing is, he remembered the whole thing, but he said it was like he felt he couldn't stop himself. Needless to say, he was really embarrassed the rest of his hospital stay. I'd like to seize this chance to say sorry to that poor guy who was around when I woke up. First thing I said was, I got a puke. And I did so generously while he helped me suffer through this. Then I looked at him and said, "What's your name?" I don't know what he answered, because he reminded me of a friend of my sister. So I told him, "Well, you look more like a Tobias to me." He laughed and said that I look like a Hugo to him then. My dizzy mind then thought it was nice to say, "So does your mom." Then I laughed and puked again. I fell asleep soon after and another nurse was there when they brought me back to my room. So I never got the chance to apologize. While it's a good story, I still feel a little embarrassed. Can just hope that guy has seen worse. I work on a floor full of patients post-surgery. One of my favorite patient comments was someone fresh from the PACU, post-anesthesia care unit, who looked straight at me and said, "You put a bag on my whiner. Didn't you?" Referring to his catheter. His mom and I were in stitches. It made a surgery that went longer and worse than expected a little bit happier. Woke up from a 2-hour reconstructive surgery on my ear. They had removed most of the skin between my ear and my head. Opened it like a door and built me a new eardrum. As soon as I woke up, I had to clean. So I started walking around the ward in my assless gown, trailing an IV, and looking for stuff to throw away. Nurse was not amused, but I refused to stop cleaning. She gave me a piece of paper and told me to throw this away then go back to bed. I agreed. Also, what's with everyone being put under for wisdom teeth removal? I had mine yanked. Then I drove home 15 minutes later. Edit, Jesus. I feel lucky my wisdom teeth came through. Doctors of Reddit, what made you say "How are you still alive?" Patient stabbed himself in the neck with a thermometer that pierced his trachea. Missed all the important arteries, carotids, vertebrals, just hit some minor nerves. Good guy patient provided his own temperature reads until they removed the thermometer. My dad's a doctor, so I asked him. Someone walked in the front door with a kitchen knife sticking out between his eyes to the handle. The knife went through his sinus cavity and ended with the tip in his throat, millimeters from his brainstem. He goes into surgery and walks out of the ICU the next day. My dad says he is the luckiest man he ever saw. Blood alcohol of 0.730. Too much blood in their alcohol system. I had a guy with a Bowie knife sticking out of his chest. The knife was pulsating. I could literally count his pulse from across the room. Sounds like the knife was preventing blood loss then? Yep. A lot of the time you don't want to pull the knife or bullet or shrapnel out of someone because it's integral to keeping them alive. Hemoglobin of 35, 3.5. In a 35-year-old guy with a chronic rectal bleed he refused to have looked into 4 months because he didn't want anyone looking at his bumhole. Finally brought to the ER by ambulance when he fainted. Aka started dying in a grocery store. Guy had an argument with his girlfriend. Wanted to leave the apartment. Instead of taking the door, was real angry and jumped off the balcony. Fell down 40 feet directly on his heels on cement. He ended up having an ankle sprain. I wondered how he managed previous issues in his life. Guy comes in with a bit of chest pain. Tells me the big coronary artery on the front of the heart was 100% blocked. I tell him, "Who told you that?" He says his doctor did about 10 years ago. I don't believe him since patients never ever get any of the stuff their doctor tells them right. I let the cardiac surgeon know what this guy said and he too goes haha 100%. So he's dead? If the biggest coronary artery is totally occluded and for 10 years no less, you are a dead man. Lo and behold, we get an angiogram and it was ducking 100% occluded. The artery on the back of the heart made a connection with the front of the heart to pick up the slack. It was some lucky shit. I used to work as a clerk in diagnostic imaging at a hospital. And we had a man come in for an x-ray complaining of chest pain. His records showed his last visit was 2 years prior when he got drunk and fell into a fish tank, breaking it. ER stitched him up and sent him home. Fast forward 2 years. And we are all gathered around the computer screen looking at an x-ray that showed a 12-inch long piece of fish tank glass sitting in his chest, with his aorta resting right on top of it. It was on an angle running from his left shoulder down towards his right hip. There were other shards of glass too, but this one was the biggest. Emergency surgery happened right away. Edit, to help clarify. This happened in Canada. Edit, I obviously didn't pick up correct info from the conversations that day the whole tempered glass situation. Sorry. Simply meeting someone who was 110 years old. Working as a phlebotomist. I've been slapped by a patient old enough to remember a good chunk of WWI. I wasn't even that mad. It was like getting hit by history. Had a patient come in confused and delirious because his kidneys were shutting down. He had multiple myeloma and a history of colon cancer plus a bunch of other things. He was jaundiced and needed to be shocked several times. The physicians, residents, and even the family thought he was going to die. The man insisted on full measures to keep him alive. He recovered in the span of 5 days. His kidneys improved. His delirium evaporated. And the man ducking walked out of the ICU. Then there was the guy who had to be castrated, but that's another story. About 20 years ago, I had a patient come in with obstruction of his colon by a large colon cancer. The cancer had spread to his liver. And CT scan showed the liver basically replaced by metastatic tumor. So he wouldn't die on intestinal obstruction. I won't go into detail. But trust me, it is a very unpleasant way to die. The patient, his family, and I decided to try placing an expandable metal stent through the tumor. It worked. His obstruction was relieved and he was able to go home to spend his last days with his family. 18 months later the patient came in for an office visit, for heartburn. He was even more jaundiced than when I first met him. But he felt basically well and was eating well. The stent was still functioning. I never saw him again and assume he finally succumbed to his disease. But he got at least 18 months of precious and really good time. Not a doctor, but been a paramedic 15 years. Had an 8-year-old kid on a ripstick, similar to a skateboard, lose control and roll into the path of an oncoming SUV in his neighborhood. He was hit by then run over by it. We arrived to find him face down under the vehicle. Unconscious. Barely breathing. After all was said and done he had bilateral femur fractures, 1 lower leg fracture, multiple rib fractures, a blown pupil, and open skull fracture, subdural brain bleed, attention pneumo, air escaping lungs into the chest cavity will squish the lungs and heart if untreated. And when we were bagging him, breathing for him, we felt subcutaneous emphysema, free air that crackles like Rice Krispies bubble wrap, in his hip. Yes, hip. We flew him to the children's hospital expecting him to die within the hour. He was in a coma for days and had to have multiple surgeries. But made a complete recovery, 100% neurologically intact as well, and graduates high school in the spring. His was such an amazing case the hospital made him one of their Miracle Kids of the Year. Parents, please make your kids wear helmets. Even in the neighborhood. It wouldn't have prevented all of his injuries, but would have substantially lessened the brain trauma he suffered. They got his age wrong in this. Yow to be. Not a doctor but encountered a woman that was shot blank in the head by her boyfriend. Bullet entered one of her eye sockets and exited above her and ear on the same side. She called 911 on her own and survived. Was in ICU 4 weeks. And testified against the bastard who is now thankfully in prison. Crazy how one person can get shot in the head and survive while another can trip on the sidewalk and hit their head in just the right way. Nurse here. 50-year-old male came to the ER after falling and not being able to get up. His testicles were so engorged they came down to his knees with the width 1.5x greater than his thigh. Pen 15 was completely retracted into his scrotum. Had a CT scan that showed his entire large intestine, most of his small intestine, and his pancreas had herniated into his scrotum. You could auscultate his bowel sounds through his gonads. The surgeon said she had never seen anything like this and that it takes months to get that way, and only happens in third world countries with poor no access to medical care. She couldn't do much because his diaphragm had become so accustomed to the altered space in his abdomen that if she put his organs back in his abdominal cavity he wouldn't be able to breathe independently, would need to be ventilated permanently. The poor guy had mental health issues, I believe schizophrenia, which is why he was in the condition he was in. He was still able to pee all by himself. As a very junior doctor I looked after this mega alcoholic who needed ascites, fluid in the abdomen caused by liver failure, tapping out every month or so. He kept coming in a worse and worse shade of yellow-green, jaundice, needing more and more fluid removed. Still merrily drinking all the while. Well, the obvious happened. He died. Now he dead. So I wander onto the ward a few weeks later to find him sitting there in bed. Green as you like. Looking very alive. Turned out his was his twin. Also an alcoholic. Also not to live much longer. Pathologist here had a guy who had died suddenly and unexpectedly. I soon learned he was the recipient of a lung transplant about 15 years prior. When I opened the man up, his transplanted lung was upside down. I flipped the lung into the proper position. And bloop. It flipped right back to upside down. That was quite alarming. The surgeons who originally performed the transplant incorrectly attached the organ. When he by chance entered the correct position, the lung flipped over, causing his pulmonary artery to seal shut, resulting in his death. The man lived for 15 years with the lung that was dying to flip upside down. And it was only by sheer chance he didn't move in such a way that allowed it to do so until the fateful day of his death. It is one of the most fascinating cases I have ever witnessed. I have thought that after seeing some CT scans of lungs in severe COPD, it's like there is no normal lung tissue, just huge air pockets. It is hard to see how they exchange oxygen and carbon dioxide at all. Currently nursing a 65-year-old woman with severe COPD. Ventolin, corticosteroids and oxygen. Still smoking. Frightens the heck out of me. I threw my cigarettes away and hope my lungs can repair somewhat. A huge wake-up call. Also not a doctor, but my very elderly great-great-uncle just had a sextuple heart bypass. Had 4 prior heart attacks. How he was still functioning somewhat normally before his last heart attack I honestly don't know. Had a gentleman in his late 50s come in with multiple myeloma. Short history of progressively worsening breathlessness. Turned out he had a pulmonary embolism, blood clot in his lungs. He was a good candidate for surgery. So he had the blood clot removed, but unfortunately the clot had caused such bad issues with his heart, acute right heart failure, that he couldn't be weaned off the bypass machine. Instead, he went to IQ on ECMO, like a circuit for your heart and lungs outside the body to give your heart lungs time to rest. His chest was still open, cannulated centrally, but covered up with sterile stuff. After 3 days, he was booked to be weaned off the ECMO or at least have the tubes put in peripherally so his chest could be closed. Morning of the procedure while he's waiting to be moved, somehow the tubing of the ECMO machine broke, oxygenator tube, and blood spilled all over the floor and he went into cardiac arrest. The cardiothoracics consultant had to do internal cardiac massage, basically CPR on the heart by squeezing it via his still open chest, until the circuit got fixed and he returned to a normal circulation. He ended up going to OT and having his chest closed, but he had more clots pulled out of his pulmonary arteries. Clots had recurred. At this point I thought this guy was utterly ducked. I figured if he even lived long enough to be woken up he'd have some degree of ischemic brain injury. After about 2 weeks the guy left ICU and a week later went to rehabilitation. Speaking, walking, cognitively largely intact. It was one of the most unbelievable things I've ever seen during my short career. Not a doctor, but a few years ago I was called into the hospital to go see my friend unexpectedly. Once there, the doctors told me my friend should be dead if not in a coma. What had happened was, that day my town had a beer fest on the main street. $20 all you could drink. We all partook, but I was sober at the time, so I just enjoyed watching my friends get ripped. Fast forward to later that afternoon, where all my friends had moved on to a friend's house, but now hard alcohol was involved. I went home to by this point because I wasn't in the party mood. My good friend hit it hard though. He was gone. 3 sheets to the wind. Pissed off his ass. He ended up taking another friend's Marto scooter out for a joyride. Ended up wrecking it pretty damn hard onto his head. When I showed up at the hospital, there were bloody rags everywhere. He was conscious and a big smile went across his sheet-faced mug when I walked in. Then he tried to escape, pulling IVs and wires off him, but I stopped him. He blew a .35 a few hours after the accident. He was a pretty heavy drinker. Tolerance saved him. Doctors told me they were in shock he wasn't in a coma or dead. Needless to say, it humbled him out pretty well. Medic, not a doctor, but my first week or so on the job we picked up the town regular. Nurse didn't even need me to say anything but let me see his admission record. If there was one visit per line, it probably would have been at least 10-15 pages. Multiple stabbings, shootings, beatings, drug and ego problems out the ass. He was set on fire twice and hit by 2 or 3 cars at highway speed. He was just unkillable. Edit. There, I punctuated properly. Are you happy now? Is this what you want? Exclamation point. Not a doctor, but I'm a nurse and my story is good too. I had a college student come into the unit on the night of their 19th birthday. They wanted to party, but had a test the next morning. One of their friends told them that if they took one Adderall for every drink that they had, they'd be sober by the morning. They had 15 shots and 15-20 milligrams Adderall tablets. If you were wondering. No. That does not make you sober. It does, however, make you rip off all your clothes in a hallway. Spit at the nurse that is trying to help you. Sheet all over everything. And then literally ducking die. Luckily for them, they weren't dead for good. We got them back and they spent most of their sophomore year of college in a hospital, with a hole in their neck, learning how to walk again. Not a doctor, but I work in cardiology. And my doctors all do rotations at our hospital. Our hospital is a level 5 trauma and it's the closest hospital to a lot of rural area. So a lot of traumas that happen way out in the middle of nowhere end up at that hospital. This guy came in having been in a car accident. He was covered in road rash and his chest was more or less torn open. Apparently, as we all later learned, he'd been drinking and riding passenger in his friend's car. He wanted out of the car. His friend said no. So this guy, once again, very drunk, decided to try and jump out of the car window. He somewhat succeeded, but his shirt caught on the side view mirror and he got dragged until the driver stopped flipping out enough to come to his senses and stop. Not a doctor. I met a guy the other night who got hit by a jet ski. It broke his femur, crushed his shoulder and split his head. He was floating in the ocean for a while and said that after 30 minutes when he finally got into the ambulance, they took one look at him and said he didn't have much of a chance of making it to even the hospital because of the blood loss. I'm happy to say that he's alive and well, and after several surgeries is walking. I'm an ER nurse. Had a guy walk up to the front desk after hitting himself in the throat with a chainsaw. All the flesh of his neck was flayed open. I could see his trachea and his right jugular vein. If he had cut in just a tiny bit deeper, he would have sliced right into both. The only thing that saved him was that he was a big fat guy with a huge neck. A skinnier man would have died very unpleasantly. Saw a guy with a machete lodged up into his skull. Asked him if he was okay, not sarcastically, just threw a generic question to check his ability to respond. He said yup. Not a doctor. My grandfather had a heart attack. He went in for a simple stent in his heart. Hours go by and we hear code blue over the intercom. Doctor comes out to tell us his left ventricle has an 1.5 inch tear in it. They had to transport him to another hospital ASAP. He died 3 times that night and went through 11 pints of blood. The surgeon successfully repaired the torn ventricle. They woke him up on my birthday and he sung me happy birthday. 3 weeks in cardiac IQ, my grandfather walked out. The surgeon told us for a man of 75 years to have lived through a left ventricle tear is unheard of. The doctor wrote a journal on him as well. He's still alive today. He even got his hip replaced a year after. Not a doctor or anything, but my grandmother has had 7 strokes. I couldn't help but laugh at the 7th one. She said, "AWW sheet. I'm having another stroke." She said this during a phone call abruptly. She's a very tough lady. She runs a garden and eats her own vegetables. Paramedic here. So many but 2 come to mind. Responded to a well-being check. Basically check on someone no one has heard from in a while. Get there and police advise the woman is dead and appeared to be so for a while. Middle of summer. Can smell her before getting close to house. Put on protective gear and air packs to move the body. She is rotting. Maggots and flies. Can see organs. We go to carefully move her into body bag and she opens her eyes and gasps. She was alive and rotting alive. We got her to the hospital alive and she lived for several days more. Second was a suicide. Shotgun to the face. He held it under chin but it slipped and he blew off front of face except one eye. He was awake and tried to talk but obviously couldn't. We ended up sedating and intubating but he lived and walked out of hospital after tons of reconstructive surgery. I was in school to be a paramedic and I was doing my externship in an ER. A guy came in happily complaining about a sore on his belly that wouldn't heal. He was really pleasant and didn't seem to be in much pain. When he lifted his shirt, we could see his liver. My story is from a guy in the town I used to live in. Guy was working with an acetylene torch and passed out. Unsure what precipitated it. Falling down on it while it was still operating. Burned a huge hole in his abdomen. Serious injuries. Had a patient who was stabbed multiple times. He was apparently leader of some gang and they thought he was conspiring against them. By the time we got him into the table he was cold. Lifeless. No pulse. Hours passed and we were sure he was gone. Shockingly, his dog jumped up on the table and he immediately gasped for air. Never seen anything like it. That snow was special. Paramedic. Not doctor. Had a patient who used a circular saw that snapped and a fragment broke off and penetrated the side of his neck. Scan at hospital showed it came ridiculously close to the main artery.